Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah barakatuhu. This is Robert from Islam for Europeans. Please like and subscribe to the channel. So I wanted to make this video on the top 10 barriers to group conversion to Islam. Now, when I talk about group conversion, what I mean is that you have a group that identifies in a particular way. They stick together as a people. They're united by language, ethnicity, culture, sometimes profession, right? And the best outcome, for the Muslim community and also for the people who convert in that group themselves is that they collectivize. They form their own organizations, their own fora, because the rest of the Muslim community, if they don't, interact with the converts' social sphere and their non-Muslim family community, it's basically left up to the converts themselves, to thrive and survive, because they have to still live in that environment. They still have to be good to their family. They still have to be good to their parents. They still have to work in that environment, and they are an ambassador to Islam as well. So I'm going to talk about what are the barriers for that to happen. Why does that not happen when it comes to certain populations, right? Just getting into the PowerPoint here. Let me just go back here. Yeah. So yeah, like I said, Muslims, non-Muslims, they live in different cultural spheres, and this goes even for different Muslim societies. Like if you look at, cities that are in the West, you have, Pakistani Muslim subcommunities, you have Syrian Muslim subcommunities. What I mean by subcommunity is that, they kind of have their, they interact with one another far more than just the mosque, right? Now, people go to the mosque from all different walks of life, and they all interact with one another. It doesn't matter where they come from, but at the end of the day, they're going to leave that mosque, go back to their normal world, right? And this is fine, for born Muslims, because they have other organizations that deal with their problems, ranging from acclimating new arrivals to teaching English as a second language, to immigration services, to driving courses, you name it, right? But one of the fallouts, if you don't have a healthy subcommunity of converts, is that Islam is going to be seen as more and more foreign, to the people themselves, right? And this is a big problem, So this goes hand in hand with some of the caveats I'm going to talk about before I begin, the list of 10. So for these 10 barriers, and again, these are the top 10 barriers. I actually had more than 10, but I had to pare it down, for time's sake. And because some of them are kind of really interrelated with one another, I had to combine a couple of them. So any of these barriers or all of these barriers may exist at any time, right? But it's good to understand them, because, we want to know how to alleviate those barriers. Now, you can never get rid of these barriers completely. Some of them are always going to be there. Some barriers can be relieved by the Muslim community themselves. Some of those barriers can be relieved by the converts, non-Muslim community in society, right? And we want to make this a theory that's testable to all cultures. Now, I know this is Islam for Europeans, and our main focus is on converts of European descent, but I want this to be like evergreen material, so that converts from any walk of life, from any country and any society, can look at these barriers, go, which of these barriers are the strongest? Which ones can we alleviate? Which ones are not that bad? And how can we understand these barriers so we can overcome them, right? Finally, like I said, a lot of people will ask us, what's the point of focusing on converts? We have all these other problems going on in the Muslim community. Do you just care about converts? Are you just centering, the problems that converts are going through? No, I think, we have to look at this holistically, that, if you have a healthy subcommunity of converts, this is going to be beneficial for the whole ummah. That includes Muslims living in the West, and even Muslims, not living in the West. So let's begin. So number one And again, these are in no particular order. Like it's not a top 10 list, going from worst to best, or strongest to faintest. So these 10 are just standalone barriers you can think of, right? So number one is the conceptual barrier, right? So what I mean by the conceptual barrier is people have to conceive in their heads that not just they can convert to Islam, but also that their group of people can become Muslim, right? Or, at least be an identifiable group that belongs to the greater Muslim community, right? I mean, the conceptual barrier, it exists on an individual level sometimes. There's still many people out there who think, that white people can't be Muslim, or Chinese people or native people, and this just comes out of, lack of knowledge. But, going further, taking it a step further than that, do you actually believe that your group of people, your tribe that you belong to, can convert to Islam as a group or a group together? Because if that doesn't exist as a concept in people's heads, they're not even going to think about it. I mean, most people who convert to Islam, they don't really think in these terms. They think I've converted to Islam, I believe it's the truth, and I'm now joining a Muslim community, and I'm abandoning, the society that I belong to. Part of this is the fact that Islamic concepts like urf and kafa are, they exist, in Muslim textbooks, but they're not really taught, or even thought about. When it comes to like Islamic organizations or courses at mosques and things like that. So I think European Muslims or white people, like this whole idea of a white Muslim subcommunity or European Muslim subcommunities, it doesn't exist in people's heads. Like it's just a fantasy. It can never happen. It's completely theoretical. Um, we'll get more into why people think that way later. But you can extrapolate this to other societies as well. Like for example, the conceptual barrier to Islam could also exist in, Latino societies or, South America. South America is overwhelmingly Christian, Catholic. Um, the idea of having, an Argentinian, Muslim community, with people, Argentinians who've been there for several generations. Um, Many people in Argentina simply can't fathom that, and, the more and more Muslims are overwhelmingly coming from other countries, the more this concept, doesn't exist in people's heads. So they don't even think about, conceptualizing this or what would be, the pros and cons of such an idea. Now, I mean, you can look at populations that have converted to Islam in the West that don't have this conceptual barrier. And I think the perfect example of that are African American Muslims, our Black American brothers and sisters. If you look, they have heroes that converted to Islam, like Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X. There are many Black rappers that are Muslim. There's a whole narrative behind it. So when a Black American converts to Islam, it's not a rejection of their, they can conceive of that idea, that they're Black and they're Muslim, right? So yeah, and that just since they don't have that barrier, it's a lot easier for them to to convert to Islam. Okay, so number two is the turnkey barrier. Now, um, in business, there's a term called a turnkey operation or a turnkey business, and basically, you can use an example of a pizza restaurant. You have a mom and pop pizza place. They've been running for 30 years. They already have an established clientele. They already have their contracts with different food companies. They already have their own advertising, their own flyers. So let's say people who run that mom and pop shop, they retire, right? There's already all a business owner needs to do is turn the key on that operation. Everything is ready to go. They don't have to make any phone calls. They just show up the next day, open up for business, and the business is already established, right? So now that's not a problem if you have a pizza place. But what happens when you have a pizza place that you know has all of a sudden everyone in their city needs to eat gluten free? Now you have to completely change everything. You have to change the advertising. You have to change the pricing. You have to change your food vendors. You have to change the way you run the business, right? So that would be a major problem. What I'm getting at is most Muslim communities in the West Uh, all of their organizations, all of their masajid are run by bored Muslims. They're geared toward the bored Muslim community. You can't really fault them for this because this is 99 to 100% of their community. So they build these mosques. They don't build with mind, there's going to be converts to Islam. How do we help them out? They're not designed for that, right? And I'll give you a perfect example. This the idea that in mosques they want everybody speaking Arabic, and a lot of Islamic leaders, they're worried that their kids, the youth, they're losing their Arabic, so their loss of Arabic is tied in with the loss of Islam, which is totally understandable. So that's why the khutbah, most of it has to be in Arabic. They speak Arabic to each other conversationally at the mosque. But what happens all of a sudden when you have a whole bunch of converts who don't speak any Arabic? Now you have to speak in English all the time, right? So it's another, it would be different if you take a city and there are no Muslims in it, and most people who find out about Islam or convert to Islam as a group who've been there for generations, they build their own mosques, they build their own organizations from the ground up, because now they're running the place and they know what will work and what will not work, right? And the perfect example, like I said before, is the African American Muslim community. When they converted, to the Nation of Islam, back in the 1920s, it was, again, it was a heretical group, but at the same time, they ran the place. They ran the mosques, they ran the programs. They were heavily involved with their own people. So, this wasn't a barrier to them. They didn't have the turnkey barrier because, there were no mosques existing before they started this whole endeavor, right? But with the turnkey barrier, since, there's people, even if you think, converts, should have their own organization, their own mosques, a lot of people will say, well, we already have mosques here. What's the point of building another mosque for converts? What's the point of, having a program for converts? We already have, a Quran class. We already have an Islam 101 class. There's no need for converts to have their own classes, right? So, yeah, it's a major problem. And as there are more Muslims coming to the West and they have all the funding, they're building more and more masajid, and they're overwhelmingly run by board Muslims. If they bring in a token convert to the board, they're just going to have the convert's going to be a yes man, and they're just going to keep running things the way that they do, and that's perfectly fine for them. But it's just not designed for converts, and not just more masajid in the same city, but as they go into smaller cities, like in Canada, we have we have a mosque now in Chatham, we have a mosque in Goderich. Even if you had a group of people who were nth generation Canadians who converted to Islam as a group, these mosques are popping up so fast that it'd be more and more difficult to get through a mosque. And you could say, well, why don't converts these are just barriers, but what's stopping you, right? So yeah, you can try to lobby for the money. It's not impossible. It doesn't make it like an impenetrable barrier to have your own organization, but it becomes more difficult because it's hard to lobby for the money because, like I said, it just seems like it's superfluous to them. Like why build another why build another mosque when we have a shortage of money to begin with. All these existing mosques are on shoestring budgets. You have horrible situations for Muslims abroad. Shouldn't the money go to them? And so on and so forth. So it's a problem. Now, one group that converted to Islam as a group and were successful, where the turnkey barrier didn't exist, was the Tzotzil Muslims in Chiapas, Mexico. Spanish missionaries came over to the city during the Zapatista rebellion. They gave dawah to the Tzotzil tribe there. They converted Islam themselves in the hundreds. But at the same time, these Spanish Islamic missionaries didn't have a mosque there to begin with, right? The Tzotzil Muslims built it themselves. They ran it themselves. So the turnkey barrier wasn't a problem for them, right? So that's barrier number two. Barrier number three, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the turnkey barrier, and that's the Medina model barrier. Now, people who've been watching my channel, they understand, I'll just reiterate what it is. The Medina model, it basically supposes that Muslims in whatever city they're in the West or in any non-Muslim country, that they need to function as a single community, regardless of our differences. So any type of like, type of like a collaboration based on shared language, culture, heritage, ethnicity. This is seen as dividing the Muslim community, and it should be stopped at all costs. You should function as a single homogeneous unit. When someone converts to Islam, they join the Muslim community. They're an integrated member of the Muslim community. And any deviation from this monocultural approach is seen as divisive, right? Now, most people who convert to Islam, they follow the Medina model to a T, right? Because they, there's this whole narrative of Muslims, being, having this great civilization spanning from Morocco to Indonesia. And, the colonial powers came in and they basically divided up the Muslim community like Swiss cheese. They drew artificial lines, creating these countries. So what caused the downfall of, the caliphate, and the Ottoman Empire was division. That's basically their catch-all explanation. So in order to overcome this, Muslims need to be united. They look to the seerah, or the story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that he united the tribes of Mecca, and building any type of mosque or any type of organization apart from that, without the approval of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was seen as treacherous, right? So this to a degree is understandable. I can understand why this sentiment exists in the Muslim community. But in the West, they've taken this to such an extreme that, people who have, specific problems or issues, especially converts, they never think of, organizing their own organization for those ends, right? So, and that's why, a lot of people who are opposed to Islam for Europeans are converts, because they think, oh, you're dividing the Muslim community. Why divide us by race and things like that? Um, so, uh, and again, we want a united Muslim Ummah as well. We understand that's important, but you have to think of it this way. Let's say, for example, you have a health network in a large city. You have doctors, you have dentists, you have, gynecologists, drug rehab specialists. They don't all function in the same hospital. It would be a disaster. You wouldn't be able to compartmentalize your professionals who deal with these problems, right? The Medina model basically says you need to have one person who's the doctor, the dentist, the gynecologist, the drug rehab specialist, the pediatrician. They need to do everything. You need to have this monolithic model in order to solve the Muslim community's problems, because anything apart from that is division, right? And the opposite of that is the Chappist model. Like I said, I talked about the Zotzil Muslims in the last slide. They realized that, the Spanish missionaries, Islamic missionaries, as nice as they were not really integrated into the society of the Zotzil tribe. The Zotzil Muslims, the converts, had to take it upon themselves, to give dawah to their own people. Right. So number 4 is the civilizational barrier. Now, people belong to different civilizations throughout history. You have the Chinese civilization, the Indian civilization, the Islamic civilization, Western civilization. These civilizations, there's a general consensus that, if you belong to a certain civilization, you must follow the state religion, right? Now, Islam is opposed to this because, we want, people should be following the truth, no matter what that is. You shouldn't be following the religion of your forefathers, even if you believe, because they could be devoid of wisdom, right? But again, Islamic civilization was vast. It encompassed many different cultures, many different societies. It's not monolithic. It's not monocultural. And, the people who did convert to Islam, they kept everything that was about themselves. So, it's important to understand that, because you want to decouple this argument. The more you concentrate on the fact that you have Western civilization, which was basically completely at war with Islamic civilization, the Ottoman Empire. The more you play into that, and Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, the more difficult it becomes to make the case that Islam could actually improve the civilization that you're in, right? So again, if you come from a Muslim civilization, there's fewer barriers to convert to Islam. Like, if you're, let's say, for example, an Indian Sikh living in Canada, right? Uh, you already understand that, there are many, many Muslims that live in the Indian subcontinent. And converting to Islam doesn't seem as that big of a jump, because you can still belong to that civilization. They're the same geographic region, their languages are mutually intelligible, and so on and so forth. The Western civilization, unfortunately, for centuries have been at odds, at war with Muslim civilization, right? And Islamic Muslim discourse between Islamic preachers and, unfortunately, the anti-Islam right. They always, always, always focus on this. It's always Islam versus the West. You have white people on one side and Muslims on the other side, and the more you do that, the more you create this um, difficulty, basically, for people who belong, are part of Western civilization to convert to Islam in the first place. And you can feel like you're part of a certain civilization without agreeing with everything that they did. Like, I know people who, are Westerners who think that, you know, Westerners should have never expanded outside of Europe. They should just stayed in Europe. They should just develop their own technology. If other civilizations wanted to improve their society, you can just, you can teach them that. They can go to the universities without having to, invade them and occupy them for centuries. Um, so there's always going to be people who are opposed to how their civilization dealt with things. Um, and there's many Westerners out there who think that the invasion of Iraq was absolutely horrible. Um, that anti-Islam sentiment is getting us nowhere. So you know my point is, if you keep concentrating on the fact that you have Muslim civilization and Western civilization, and never the twain will meet, it's a net negative on the whole for the whole Muslim community and the whole ummah, and and for converts as well. So and finally, is another point. All civilizations that are now majority Muslim, if you look at their history, at one point they hated Islam. I think that's Allah says that. If any of you turn back from your religion, I will replace you with another people, and they will fear Allah and not be concerned about the consequences. You can look at the Quraysh, the people in the Arabian Peninsula. They were pagans. They wanted to wipe Islam off the map, and then their ancestors converted to Islam en masse. The Persian civilization, they hated Islam at one point, and then lo and behold, now their society is majority Muslim. The Afghans, in Thomas Walker Arnold's book, The Spread of Islam in the World, the Afghans at one point they hated Islam. Um, then sub-Saharan Africans at one point they wanted to kill everyone who was Muslim in their society. So this is nothing new. I mean, you're always going to have different civilizations. Islam is going to take hold, but the more you keep pitting these civilizations against each other in the discourse, the more difficult it is for people to convert to Islam and not be seen as a traitor to the people. Right. So shifting gears, number 5 is the gender barrier. Right. So the gender barrier basically means, creating an organization or having an organization with a different culture, that's an enormous challenge in and of itself. You can look to, say, for example, um, like an environmental movement or something like that, or like a parents teachers association. If that's challenging enough, right? Now, on top of that, you add this additional challenge where both genders have to be completely separated. So there's no two-way communication. Um, unless you have, like parallel institutions run by both men and women, that's going to be an even bigger barrier, right? Now, when it comes to people who are born into Muslim communities, they already have these parallel institutions for both genders, right? If you look at, say, for example, the Pakistani Muslim community, or even, let's take, for example, the Tablighi Jamaat. When you look at, Tablighi Jamaat in mosques, they're all run by men, right? But even the women, they have their own, I guess the wives of the Tablighi Jamaat, they kind of have their own thing going on, in their own houses. So someone converts to Islam, the woman from the Tablighi Jamaat, will take them in, give them tea, and things like that. So they've already had the time and the money and the resources to have, like different spaces and classes and things like that for men and women, right? But for converts, we don't really have this. We're basically these atomized individuals, and it's difficult enough meeting converts of the same gender. And on top of that, when you add the fact that you have complete gender separation at the mosque, if the mosque allows women whatsoever, Islamic, um, like like conferences, um, like restaurants, and just the general mores of interactions online, like to DM a Muslim of the opposite gender, is seen as a taboo, right? So how can you possibly form an organization or collectivize as converts when you can't even communicate, between genders? And I'm not advocating for breaking the rules of Islam. I mean, I don't think that we should be doing that. I think we want to follow the teachings of our Prophet, peace be upon him, and Islam is very strict when it comes to gender separation. But again, there's you can still have respectful interaction. You can still talk to people on a professional level between genders, to achieve certain goals. That's fine. That's halal. But you shouldn't be in the same room together. Physical contact between genders is not allowed. But it's just another barrier. Like, and think about the fact that it's more difficult to find a spouse of the same, of another gender, from the same background if you don't have these set in place. I mean, born Muslims, when they look for a spouse, their mom or their dad, they already know all these different Muslim families through the grapevine. So though they can investigate for a potential spouse. But for converts, especially, white converts, that doesn't exist. We don't have that kind of setup in place. And finally, when it comes to European converts to Islam, there's also an ideological barrier between men and women. I mean, many, not all, but many female converts to Islam, they have you're kind of left. They tend to be either very left wing or left of center. Um, Many of them convert, at the university level. There might be some Muslim women in like their gender studies program. They might join like the MSA, which is usually has like these intersectionality groups. They ally with like feminist groups. Um, they tend to be on the whole more left wing than male converts to Islam. And again, there's some male converts to Islam that are left wing, but there's also many male converts who convert to Islam, because they see the West as degenerate. They read up on Julius Evola, Rene Guénon, and they think that Islam is going to save Western civilization. They may listen to Andrew Tate or Sneeko, and those tend to be more right wing. So even though male white converts and female white converts, they're both Muslims, there's still this ideological gap in terms of their path to converting to Islam, which is going to make it a challenge if two of them are going to get married. And if you look at the African American Muslim community, they worked around this because they worked from the ground up, and the Black American men and Black American women who converted to Islam, they were on the same page. I was reading Malcolm X's book, even in the Nation of Islam days. The female Black American converts to the Nation of Islam, they even have their own drug rehab programs that were, separate from the men's group. So they had parallel institutions for both men and women. So they got around this barrier. Okay, number 6, and this is kind of related to the last point I made, and that's the relationship barrier. So the situation, for born Muslims living in the West is that they're coming from, Muslim countries. Many of them have varying levels of religiousness. Some are very religious. Some are not religious at all. They're just hanging on by their religion by a thread. And they kind of some of them see their religion, Islam, as like just part of their culture. They don't really pray. They may fast during Ramadan, but they, don't follow all the rules. Right. And, basically what happens is that you have many non-Muslims, both mostly women, but also men. They learn about Islam not from reading a book or from going to the mosque or an open house, but from their non-practicing boyfriend or girlfriend, Muslim boyfriend or girlfriend or Muslim spouse, right? And this could be kind of termed as dawa dating. And what happens is that you have the person who converts may be sincere. I'm not trying to fault them, for this. They're, I guess, kind of maybe unaware that if you're a Muslim, you shouldn't be doing this. Because, like I said, Islam is very strict on gender separation. But a lot of these people are converting to Islam and they're already in a relationship, with the born Muslim from another culture. So they may be totally opposed to, this what we're proposing, right? Um, or maybe even if they agree with what we're talking about, their spouse may, disagree. So usually, the people who are already in these relationships, they're already at odds with group conversion, because they kind of belong to both groups, or maybe they've rejected their society already. um, Maybe their family hates the fact that they married a Muslim, so they kind of see their community and family is kind of irredeemable, and they've already married into a Muslim family. So what's the point of creating your own group? It's antithetical. They see it as either they're racist or it's not going to benefit me, and my kids are going to feel excluded, things like that. Um, so you have a situation where converts, they're trying to follow all the rules of Islam, including the ones about gender separation. And then at the same time, you have many, not all, but some born Muslims who aren't following any of the rules. So they're dating non-Muslims left, right, and center. They're and once they want to get married, they have to introduce them to their family and say, okay, now you got it. Now maybe you should convert to Islam. Um, and we can get into how those relationships end up, but usually there's like a conflict in terms of religiosity, right? So that's the relationship barrier. Okay, number 7 is the anti-Islam barrier. So the more the converts family and community, the more they hate on Islam, the more antipathy they have towards Islam, the more difficult group conversion becomes, right? um, you know uh, any non-Muslim group that you have, whether that's Latinos or uh, like Native Americans, or if you belong to like the Chinese community, you're always going to have a range of opinions on Islam. Some are going to hate it, some are going to admire it, and everywhere in between, right? But you know, if you have situations where converts are getting kicked out of their house and written out of the will, fired from their jobs, it's going to be more difficult for them to collectivize in any way, shape, or form. One, because economically they're going to be in deep trouble. Many converts are on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Many of them are poor, just hanging on by a thread. And on top of that, marrying another convert becomes all the more difficult because not only do you have to deal with a family that hates Islam, but you're going to have to deal with your spouse's family that may hate Islam, right? So now you have to deal with two families that are Islamophobic. Um, and that makes it more difficult to collectivize as people. And on top of that, you have people who are converting to Islam. They're already married, but their spouse is totally against it, and they end up getting divorced, right? If there is less antipathy towards Islam amongst their people, they may have stayed married. Their kids may have stayed, their families may have stayed intact, and who knows, down the road, maybe their wife or husband may have converted to Islam, right? So, that way that family who's already has an established, family community would have already stayed intact. You can help build this community from the ground up, right? And, we should really be pointing this out because the anti-Islam right and the dissident right, they are completely at odds with one another. The anti-Islam right, the more they hate on Islam, the more difficult it is for converts to collectivize, to marry each other. And this has a negative effect on the total fertility rate of the country, right? So, we should be pointing this out that the more you hate on Islam, you're really shooting yourself in the foot in terms of like your demographic, situation. Um, because if it were the case that, for example, if there's a British Muslim sub-community of, native Brits who converted to Islam, had families and communities and their own organizations and things like that, then they would be having more children. Their children would be marrying each other. And Islam would be seen as actually improving the total fertility rate. But because there's so much anti-Islam sentiment, it's more difficult for that to happen. Right. So number 8 is the woke barrier. So what I mean by woke is that some people who convert to Islam, um, you know, they just see their own people in society as irredeemably racist, irredeemably Islamophobic. They've joined a Muslim community. They want to try to fit in with the Muslim community. In order to do that, they, say things that are completely against their own people, extremely in this case, anti-white, sentiment. Can you imagine like, someone in China converting to Islam and then saying nothing but bad things about Chinese people afterwards? You're going to make it very difficult on yourself. You're going to make it difficult on the Muslim community in general because, they're going to be increasingly, Islam is going to be increasingly seen as the enemy. And, you don't even think about grouping together because in your head, the example of, some like leftist white converts, the idea of white people collectivizing in any way, shape, or form, even as for the betterment of their own selves and the Muslim community at large, is seen as inherently racist. Uh, you know, uh, a black hole is going to open up in the sky. The next thing we're going to start advocating for pogroms for the rest of the Muslim community. Like, and even if you don't feel this way, even if you feel that, I think Islam is a good thing for white Westerners, and I don't hate white people. There are some converts that feel this way, but, legal societal barriers prevent this. I mean, you know, you already have Islam in Spanish. You already have organizations for African American Muslims. Legally, these things can exist, but Islam for Europeans, I think we're the only organization that I'm aware of that exists that is an organization for Muslims of European descent, right? So the whole zeitgeist prevents that from happening, right? If the woke barrier was lighter, or if white converts didn't hate on their own people all the time, you might see these sub communities pop up. And finally, it just creates an atmosphere where just fewer conservative white people convert to Islam to begin with, because they see that you have a Muslim community that's so anti-white, including the converts. They may think that Islam is true, but they're not really going to find a home with their own conservative white non-Muslims, and they're certainly not going to find a home with the conservative Muslim community. So they end just being totally alone, really. So that definitely, I think, is an enormous barrier. We also have the individualism barrier. So, um, generally speaking, people who come from individualistic societies, they're less likely to collectivize to begin with, right? They kind of have like a do-it-yourself mentality. They don't really know that many other Westerners to begin with. Maybe the people next door. They may people in their AA meeting. But for the most part, it's not really a society where everyone has this kind of like collective mentality. Where everyone plays with each other. Each other's children play with each other. I mean, the West used to be less individualistic, but it's kind of like the whole go West, young man, do for yourself. Like forget about everybody else. When you come from an individualistic society and you convert to Islam, you don't really have this kind of group mentality to begin with. And the idea of like collectivizing as a people, for the people who've converted to Islam, it just doesn't. Like I said, it's part of the conceptual barrier. It doesn't exist as a concept that people said. The Tzotzil Muslims, they came from a collectivist culture, so it was a lot easier for them to group together as a people, right? So this is the individualism barrier doesn't exist for them, right? And finally is the dropout barrier. So in general, in the West, most people who convert to Islam, um, they don't really integrate into masjids, and if they do, they usually drop out after a certain period of time. Um, you know, it's unfortunate. There's the whole ongoing joke. They should create a revolving door in mosques for converts. I keep going to Juma prayer. I'm the only convert there. Um, and it's difficult to create an organization when the converts just don't get involved in any type of Islamic environment. uh, you know uh, it's unfortunate. I mean, after usually most converts will end up leaving the Muslim community and end up leaving Islam altogether. So it becomes a numbers problem. A lot of people say, why create an organization for converts, or converts of a certain ethnicity or language or culture, if you don't have the numbers? Right. Well, you do have the numbers. People are converting to Islam. There's been a 400% increase in conversions to Islam, but we really have nothing for them. Mosques are designed for born Muslims, and that's definitely a barrier. Now, if they eventually, once you start creating these organizations for converts, I think if the whole field of dreams idea, if you build it, they will come. Then I think once you start seeing more converts, it'll kind of have this domino effect. Um, but it's still a major challenge that we have to deal with. So Right. So to sum up, I know I've talked at length, but just to sum up the 10 barriers, and again, these are not the only 10. Number one, the conceptual barrier. Number two, the turnkey barrier. Number three, the Medina model barrier. Number four, the civilizational barrier. Number five, the gender barrier. Number six, the relationship barrier. Number seven, the anti-Islam barrier. Number eight, the woke barrier. Number nine, the individualism barrier. And number 10 is the dropout barrier. So whew, that was a long speech, but hopefully that provides some food for thought. And again, this can be applicable to any non-Muslim society, no matter what country Muslims are in. You have to look at these 10 barriers. How can we alleviate them? How can we at least understand, like, what the barriers are before we try to make it easier for people to not just convert to Islam, but actually stay in the Muslim community and create an environment that facilitates people converting to Islam, because like I said, this is going to be good not just for the converts themselves, but for the Muslim community at large. Islam will be seen as like a positive thing as opposed to a negative thing. That's my time for the day at Islam for Europeans. Please let me know what you think in the chat. I'm your host, Robert. Please like and subscribe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuhu.